Thank you very much, and it's a great honor to be here with this distinguished panel and audience and our friends at the PFRDA. As Honour Rule said in this morning's session, he was here the first conclave, as was I, where we were talking about the potential for doing some collaboration. And so it's fantastic to be here now with Mr. Verma and the team to actually help put some of these ideas into practice. So let me just go through three things briefly. So one is the overall framework. The second is why sustainability is so important. And then the third is talking about coverage expansion and the regulations, though I'll do that relatively briefly because my colleague Robert Palacios is going to be taking that forward in more detail in the following session. So let's talk about the overall framework. And I don't think any of us we certainly didn't compare notes beforehand, but there's a high degree of commonality. So we think about going across this slide, old age income security. It's not public or private pensions, it's public and private pensions. And one of the consistent messages is pensions is a difficult business, so take a slice of retirement income from wherever you can get it. So what does that mean in addition to pensions? That means your family, the insurance market, working life, flexible working from housing. And all of these things are an important part of the picture. And we focus a lot on risks in pensions. All of them have risks. No one knows what's going to happen in 50 years. And so the advice is to take away something from all of these strands, not overly rely on anything. And I'm reminded when I used to work in the finance ministry, so relying on your family, it's a good tradition in India, and it's maybe reducing, but it will still be part of the solution, but it's risky. And there was a tax we were responsible for, an inheritance. And I was asking someone in the tax ministry, why did anyone pay this tax? Because it's so easy to avoid. And he said, the thing you have to understand is the only people that people hate more than the taxman is their family in certain cases. So you need to make sure it could be a good source of finance, but it's never going to be the thing which you can rely on. So take a slice from everything. And then build the solutions with the capital market that you have, with the labor market you have. So we've heard a lot about the unorganized sector. And one of the consistent themes in the work we're doing is, as Professor Asher says, it's not just 85% of unorganized. It's a very diverse group of people. So be very ruthless in terms of looking at the data, segmenting it, going through it. And the good picture is, in theory, get this right, you help the capital market, you work with the labor market, you invest assets, it's good for the long-run development. That's the sort of marketing brochure, if you like. This doesn't happen automatically. India has already done a whole range of sensible things in terms of creating the NPS architecture. But the road from here will require a great deal of active, proactive work rather than just relying on these things to develop organically. Now, if that's the sort of optimistic side, let me do a few slides on the pessimistic parts. And it's, we've heard a lot, India is a young country, and that's certainly true. Green in this global picture means that you're relatively young. Red, as you can imagine, and the darker colors means that you're relatively old. And then you transition, and you see India there again has got older. Certainly not the oldest, but as much as anything, it's the rate of change which is something to deal with, which is problematic rather than the absolute levels. And the particular challenge, as we know, if you then look at coverage, where yellow here is low coverage countries in terms of contributions to pensions, not the only story because you need direct transfers from governments as well. But if you start, even if you're young, if you start young with very, very low coverage, you're not really in a better position from a country which is older but with better coverage. So better to think of yourself as already having the challenge rather than having an easier ride. And to sort of add to the note of pessimism, this slide shows you how the costs of healthcare rise with an aging population. And on the right-hand side, we're showing how as people get progressively older, you have to spend more and more money, more and more share of your budget on those old people. So greater longevity is one of the greatest gifts or greatest achievements of a modern society. And it should be seen as such, but it comes with something that you have to plan for. So as we're dealing with the pension solutions, we need to recognize that there are going to be other calls on that GDP, other calls on public finances, to try and develop something which is, entire within itself, rather than thinking you've got huge slices of the budget that you can take because you're going to have to be fighting with other people there. And then the final slide on the sort of depressing thing, if you like. So what are the consequences of failure? So what we see here is the cuts in pay-as-you-go pension benefits in a whole host of developed countries. And you don't have to look at the individual slides, but as you go down, as the chart spreads to the right, that's bigger and bigger cuts. And if you look at Italy at the bottom, nearly 50% cut in the real term value, and it's a whole combination of growing less fast, benefits which come 5 years later than you expected. So you are going to have to do adjustments in any country, but get this right now, because inevitably these are incredibly painful things to deal with politically. So if that's the sort of the challenging environment, let's talk about expanding coverage. So I think the key message is, in the way that you want to take a slice of lots of different ways of segmenting the market and doing something which is different for agricultural workers, something which is different for formal workers, something which is different from informal workers linked to formal workers. So everyone in this room who has a cook or a driver or a housekeeper, they may well be informal, but the employer is often formal. And Brazil, for example, has used targeting the formal workers to expand coverage of pensions and other benefits to the informal. So you look in a very open-minded way at all of the different sectors. But critically, what you've got with the MPS is an infrastructure on which you can build, which is really, I think, world-class. So Professor Atscher went through some of the costs in various other countries. A comparable basis assets under management cost of the NPS is 18 basis points. Now, does it have to be 18? Could it be more if you need greater incentives? Possibly. But in our work, 50 basis points and below is world-class. And there are lots of countries with far more developed pension systems who are taking away 100 basis points or more. So what does that mean? If you think that you have 3% real returns over 40 years would be a good achievement. So what does 1% in costs mean? 1% always sounds like a small number. It means a third of your real returns are going. What if it's 1.5% of costs? We're actually working in Turkey where it's 250 basis points in an individual pension system, which relies heavily on retail commissions. You're taking more or less all of your real returns in costs. So this focus on the architecture and leveraging it is absolutely central. And in terms of the theme of a good product with a bad market, absolutely there are challenges with making it work, but never move away from the NPS architecture and the overall benefits that it can deliver. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through each of these elements in great detail because my colleague will go through it, but the message that we're trying to get across is it's not going to be one of these things, it's going to be all of these things. And if you can make a 10% improvement in each of these, that adds up to something which is very significant, rather than thinking that there's any single magic bullet. Let me touch briefly on these slides, and I'm going to come back to it in the third session when we're talking more about investment. But without looking at the detail of this, this is more for you to take away. But when people talk about how can you make the investment more productive, so how can you get better returns from the assets under management, and there's discussion about should you have greater flexibility in investment. And one of the central things in the countries that we work in is people want these assets, these pension assets, to go and fund infrastructure. And you have lots of charts. So the top line, there's 79 trillion assets under management US dollars globally in institutional investment. But the current allocation to infrastructure is less than 1%. And people talk about, well, why don't we just let pension systems invest in infrastructure? And the core message really here is doing this well is challenging. And you need strong governance, real expertise, and scale to invest in infrastructure well. And the MPS architecture potentially gives you that because you're aggregating the assets and then you're deciding the asset allocation strategy. But to do the infrastructure well, you'll need to find a way in which you can go to specialist infrastructure managers. So in Turkey, for example, where they have a similar amount of money in assets under management, it's cut into 19 separate companies. And even though some of those asset managers are world leading, by their own admission, they don't have the scale in their operations to properly invest in infrastructure, even though Turkey is one of the best markets in the world to invest in infrastructure. So one of the challenges that we should be working on is how do you get the whole market, perhaps 5% of the assets allocated to an infrastructure provider, but a specialist one, rather than expecting every single asset manager to have an ability to invest in infrastructure. Because the evidence is that they can't do that well. And then the fees that you're going to be paying to the intermediaries are basically capturing all of the upside returns. So the message really is you can do much better in terms of the investment with the assets, but you need to keep this central notions of strong governance, scale, and expertise to do that. Let me, in the interest of time, let me skip through to the final element. So Onur Rule mentioned this morning about one of the elements. The project is focusing on expanding coverage, and it's also focusing on the regulatory and the supervisory underpinnings. So the PFRDA, I think, is already establishing a strong track record, as people were talking about this morning. It's going to have an increasingly important role. The passage of the Act gives it responsibility for pensions broadly, with certain exceptions. The APY scheme introduces defined benefit elements as well as defined contribution elements. And the coverage expansion is a huge and important task which requires looking through national, regional, local markets, looking across the whole range of people's different existence, turbulent working lives, and as well as getting to know and getting closer to a whole employer market. Auto-enrollment can work incredibly well if there's an employer. And then also thinking through how to leverage the profound technological benefits you have in India in the way you've established the schemes, in the way you've had unique ID and the Aadhaar number and related things. So you're in a position which other countries couldn't do to create millions of accounts at a touch of a button. So you don't need to have huge amount of upfront costs. And then the question is, how do you get the incentives, how do you get the contributions into those accounts? So it's a very significant and challenging issue, but it's one where if you keep the faith with the architecture, the low costs, and the innovation you've already shown, and push on through lots of incredibly difficult work on all of the channels, on all of the segments, on all parts of the value chain, we strongly believe you can achieve very significant developments going forward. Thanks very much.